Well, thank you everyone for being here. It really is an honor for us to come to something like this. That it kind of reminds me when I was a kid, in my hometown, we have the largest agricultural show in the world. So it's like a place for farm geeks and farm kids to go. This is kind of the equivalent for the intelligence world. So it's really just an honor to be here with Adam and myself, to be doing something that is really out of the ordinary. Adam's a lawyer, I'm a farmer. It's being on, chair and ranking member of the Intelligence Committee has really been an honor for me to work with the men and women all over the country and within the United States that do very difficult work on a 24/7 basis. That I always like. One of my favorite quotes of Director Clapper is that there's only policy success and intelligence failures. And one of the roles that I think Adam and I try to play is to make sure that we're always standing up for the intelligence community, because we know the work that you all do and how important it is, and that you often don't get the credit that you deserve. So we spend a lot of time trying to do that. This has been a busy year for us. We've had 3 bills that have piled up on our desk quickly right out of the gate. We had the FISA reauthorization, now known as the USA Freedom Act. And then in addition to that, we had cyber legislation, and then passing the intelligence authorization bill. So we have done all 3 of those bills in a short amount of time, in a transition period, and then in addition to a period where we have an increasing threat level, to which I believe personally that it's the highest threat level that we've faced. So with that, I do appreciate the invitation here and look forward to taking all of your questions. Mr. Schiff.
Well, it's a pleasure to join you, and we've been looking forward very much to the conference. Devin and I have had a great working relationship, and we're carrying on much in the tradition of Mike Rogers and Dutch Ruppersberger, and making sure that our committee operates in a very bipartisan, indeed nonpartisan way. I think what really cemented it for us, though, apart from us being both Californians, is we have the rare anomaly that you have 2 members of Congress who are both Oakland Raider fans. It's rare enough these days.
That was classified, by the way.
Oh, it
was just say that.
Darn it.
Embarrassing.
Yeah, it is a bit embarrassing. It's not easy being a Raider fan, but that probably would be a conversation for another day. As Devin was saying, we've had an enormously busy start to the committee with these 3 major bills back to back, but have worked extraordinarily well together and have a great admiration for the work that you do. All of the professionals, both in the private sector and the public sector, when we have a chance to go and visit your facilities and see the work you're doing, or you have the opportunity, if opportunity is the right word, to come testify before our committee, we're always just extraordinarily impressed with the brilliance of what you're able to put together. And I think in an era when our military presence around the world is drawing down, we're increasingly reliant on good intelligence to keep the nation safe. And in the GEOINT space, we not only see tremendous applications in terms of our intelligence and national security, but we also are seeing the extraordinary possibilities and realities of the use of that intelligence to look at everything from the spread of Ebola, issues involving water scarcity, which is a big subject for us in California as well. Really across the board, the tremendous value of GEOINT and geospatial data. So we're really in awe of the work that you do, and it's a pleasure to come and have a chance to talk with you about it today. I want to thank the Foundation for inviting us, for the great work it does in terms of providing scholarships for young people who are setting out in this space with all the exciting possibilities it has to offer. We look forward to hearing your questions, and once again, thanks so much for inviting us.
So we'll be looking for questions from the audience. You'll have an opportunity, but because I'm standing here and I don't have any questions yet, I'm going to take prerogative and ask a first question, if that's all right.
I'd be shocked if a reporter doesn't have
What's that?
any questions.
You got to write quickly, because otherwise, I'll take up all the time. We are less than, about a week from the deadline on the Iran nuclear deal, probably some few days beyond that. There's not a lot of talk right now about what happens if the deal falls through. And there have just been some stories this week about military options that follow. And I just wonder, from an intelligence perspective, how well does without getting into classified information, in general terms, how well does the U.S. really know the locations of Iran's nuclear facilities to make a military option beyond the follow-on effects and backlash, et cetera, to make a military option actually a practical one, an effective one, if negotiations fail?
Well, I think it'd be a long step to go that we're going to move quickly to a military type of operation or an answer if talks fall through. I'm not comfortable with where the talks are now, but we'll see whenever the deal comes out and what it actually entails. Then it needs to come back to Congress and should be voted on. My concern would be that if any sanctions are lifted and we release large amounts of capital to the regime, that could be potentially a problem, plus opening the gate for our partners and allies, Europeans and others, to start to begin to trade with Iran. Over the long run, I think that could be very detrimental and put back kind of the strategy that's been in place for the last 10 years, which has been to always increase sanctions and to try to weaken the regime through that so that there would be an uprising of the Iranian people to have a change in their leadership there. Just on the question of whether or not we know where the other locations are of the other types of activities they're doing, we don't know what we don't know. And there was a few years ago we weren't sure that the Iranian capabilities to where they were. The Iranian capabilities were not known to us, and I think they were a lot farther down the road than what most of our intelligence community believed. And that is not because the intelligence community did anything wrong. It's tough to know when you have a closed country like that are trying their best to hide from us and our allies.
Jim, I would say a couple things. I think at the moment the negotiations have slowed, in part a result of Secretary Kerry's injury, and there are also some health issues on with respect to one of the Iranian negotiators. So I think it looks increasingly unlikely that we're going to meet a June 30 deadline. But frankly, I think from the U.S. position, we'd be better off not putting too much focus on that deadline. I think the interim deadline that we had for the interim agreement worked in the Iranian favor, in the sense that I think the Iranians felt that deadline was more important to us than it was to them. And I don't want to see us recreate that dynamic around the final deadline. I do think that what's likely to happen if there's no agreement is the Congress will pass another round of sanctions. We will do our best to keep our European and other allies on board with the sanctions we already have. The Iranians will start to spin up their centrifuges again. They'll go to their 20% enriched uranium that they already had. They'll probably go well beyond that. And then we'll be in a race for time. Will the increased sanctions force Iran back to the table to make more concessions than they were willing to make thus far? Or will Iran get to the point where they cross Israel's red line or our own? And which will come first? The issue that you mentioned, how much do we know about where the Iranian nuclear activities are going on? I think we know enough to set back the program for a period of years with a military strike. You're not going to be able to set it back permanently unless you periodically were to engage in a military strike, because Iran still has the knowledge about how to enrich uranium and how to probably weaponize it. I will say this, though, that that's a key issue, I think, in the remaining issues that are yet to be resolved, and if there's an agreement to be reached, in the sense that many of us are much more concerned about work Iran might do, not in the places that we know about that we'll be inspecting, like Natanz and Fordow, but rather in other locations. And so that one of those remaining issues about can we get anytime, anywhere inspections, or, you know, as the Ayatollah recently pronounced, there won't be any inspections on military facilities. How that issue is resolved will say a lot about whether this agreement is really viable or not, because we are going to need the ability to inspect other locations than those that are currently known about if we have intelligence to believe they're conducting weaponization or other work or doing R&D on advanced lines of centrifuges that they're not permitted to. So I think that's a key remaining issue in the negotiations.
All right, great. Well, in that time, we've gotten a lot of questions in, so I want to go to some of the audience. And just two at the very top, both asking about sequestration. One asking, are we headed for another sequestration? Your view on the likelihood of sequestration surviving given the effect on national security?
Well, we have a lot of deadlines coming up that the Congress has to deal with, and I think it's important to look at the whole picture and then how that relates to sequestration. So we have a debt limit vote coming up soon, probably in the fall. We have to increase the debt limit, which is how we got sequestration in the first place. At the same time, we're looking at the highway funding running out at the end of July, which somehow that's going to have to be extended. And the Congress has really picked all the easy fruit, low-hanging fruit, in order to what we call pay-fors here in Washington, to pay for these programs. And so we're really at a time where we've got to make big decisions based on whether or not we're going to do major reforms that are going to increase our economic growth. Because if we continue to have a sluggish economy, and I know the economy's improved a little bit, but we really need to start seeing 3 or 4% economic growth if we're going to be able to grow our way out of our spending problem. And if you don't have that, then you have to look at major austerity measures, and sequestration was a part of an austerity measure. So at the same time, the way we're dealing with it this year, which I know Mr. Schiff has raised some issues about this, and the Democrats, but is we're using the what they call OCO funding to make sure that we meet all the needs across the Department of Defense and the other national intelligence programs. So it's one of those. There's no easy answers. It takes leadership. But we feel comfortable, or I feel comfortable, with where we're at in terms of the intelligence community budget going into next year.
Is sequestration making the U.S. less safe?
Not yet. Mm-hmm. Could. If we didn't have the OCO funding and the plus-ups, then it could. But for now, it's just been a kind of a mechanism that forces political movement, which is never easy.
Congressman Schiff?
Jim, I remember when we took up the sequestration bill years ago as an effort to deal with our deficit, and I think the conventional wisdom at the time, which proved to be inaccurate, was the way the bill worked and would cap defense expenditures and cap non-defense expenditures if we failed to reduce the deficit by a certain amount. The expectation was that Democrats would never let sequestration go into effect because they would never be willing to stomach the cuts to non-defense discretionary spending. And Republicans would never be willing to accept sequestration because they would never be willing to accept the cuts to defense. I think where the miscalculation took place is that the deficit hawks among the GOP were stronger than the defense hawks. And so ultimately, we ended up with sequestration, something I think that nobody either expected or wanted. It's obviously a very poor way of budgeting because you're cutting the good, the bad, the efficient, the inefficient, all across the board without respect for how well things are working or where you need to make your investments. So I think left to run its course, it is very destructive of our country, both in terms of our defense and in terms of our non-defense priorities. As Devin was saying, this is going to have to be worked out, and I think this year may be the year where there's sort of a reckoning with the havoc that's been brought about by this, because all of the budget has the mechanism that Devin referred to, the use of this overseas contingency account, the OCO, and the reason why that OCO is significant is money that is spent as part of OCO. OCO was intended basically to be an emergency kind of war funding account. It doesn't have to count against the budget. In other words, it's off-budget spending. And so we're employing this fiction that we're balancing our budget because we're taking a huge amount off budget. But because that's built into the budget now, all the appropriation bills are being aligned with the use of that OCO. The defense bill relies on the use of OCO, and our intelligence bill relies on OCO, and the White House has threatened to veto all of these. And the Senate is holding up all the appropriation bills because of the reliance on OCO. So at the end of the day, and this is above our pay grade, the leadership is going to have to work this out. What budget are we really going to operate under? What things are properly under OCO? And what's the overall budget cap going to be? And frankly, I hope they work it out, and I hope they work it out soon, because all of the work that Dev and I are doing, as well as our committee members, in terms of trying to prioritize, what are we investing in overhead architecture, how much are we allowing the private sector to do, and what's the role of the private sector in our IC constellation. All of these things that we are working with you on are essentially vacated if we can't pass an authorization bill. And I think probably key to the passage of an authorization bill and a defense bill is working out this OCO and sequestration issue.
Okay, cyber, key issue to all of us. Anybody who's ever filled out an SF-86, myself included, now in the hands of a handful of Chinese hackers. Cyber legislation. Can legislation help us get in front of this threat?
You want to go first?
Well, I mean, this is a problem that is just growing exponentially, and leads me to suspect that if you're a major or even minor firm right now, well, particularly in the defense area, but just about any area, and you haven't been hacked yet, it's only that you don't know you've been hacked yet, and on average, it'll take you about 7 months to figure out you've been hacked. If you're the government, it may take you longer. And we've seen just an increasing severity of cyber intrusions, obviously of a very different complexion. Some, like the Sony hack, are nation-state-sponsored attacks meant to do damage. Others are nation-state intrusions designed to gather intelligence, and still others are groups of very sophisticated, sometimes state-aligned, sometimes independent groups of hackers who have a variety of motivations, from simple theft and fraud to exposure of state secrets. So we're facing just a broad array of threats. I think in this playing field, those on the offense have all the advantage. They have all the economies on their side. When you're on defense, you've got to protect against every potential vulnerability. When you're on offense, you just need to exploit the weakest link. And we're seeing the adverse impacts of this, most recently with the really phenomenally damaging hack of OPM, which we're still trying to assess. We're still trying to get to the bottom of just how bad it is, but it's really bad, and the repercussions are going to be with us for years to come. Now, we worked hard on cyber information sharing legislation this year. We passed it out of the House with broad bipartisan support. We addressed, I think, all of the issues that had been raised with the legislation in the last session. We require the private sector to scrub information before they share it with the government. We require the government to re-scrub if there's still private information left. We require the use of a civilian portal. We limit how that information can be utilized. We've addressed, I think, all of the privacy interests that were raised. We hope that the Senate will take it up soon. There was an effort to attach it to the defense bill, which failed, and we hope it'll be taken up soon as a standalone measure so that we can send it to the president. But I don't think we should be under any illusion that that information sharing bill will help. It'll help, with known attacks so that we can share information with you in the private sector, and you can share information with us in the public sector, so that when a company is attacked, it can alert other companies. You need to be on the lookout for, defend against this kind of malicious code. But that's not going to be the end-all by any means of the challenges that we face. And I'll just make one mention of something I think we really need to grapple with, because I think we're still far from resolving this, and that is we can't just be on defense. We need to also establish a deterrent. I don't think that the North Koreans feel they suffered any repercussion from the attack on Sony. And I think that's going to tell the North Koreans and others that cyber attacks are essentially freebies, because there's difficulty in attribution. And even when you're able to attribute attack, there's difficulty in being able to demonstrate the validity of that attribution, because that often will require the disclosure of classified information. And what's more, it's difficult to retaliate, because they can try to hide the source of the attack. And even if you can identify precisely what computers originated the attack, often your adversary may be in a position to do you more damage than you do them. After the North Korean hack, you might remember there was all this speculation, because the power grid and the lights went out in North Korea, about whether this was our cyber response. The reason that was such an open question was the lights and the power go out all the time in North Korea. I mean, their infrastructure is so poor, you couldn't tell whether they were being retaliated against or not. And plainly, they can do us a lot of damage. And while we have far greater capabilities, there's a disproportionality and an asymmetry that works in their favor. But that being said, I really do think that we need to develop the rules of the road. What constitutes essentially an act of war in the cyber realm? What is the proportionate response? And we're going to have to let our adversaries know when they attack us that there will be repercussions. And I don't think that's something that can be done anonymously. So this is an area of policy making that I think we are on the threshold of and have far more work we need to do.
Congressman Nunes, do you think that China believes it got a free pass too on, and not just, I know that there hasn't been a public attribution of responsibility for the OPM attack, but certainly China's been hacking US businesses, et cetera, for years. Do you believe they feel that they've suffered any penalty as a result of that?
Well, first, the investigation's ongoing, so I don't think we want to make any accusations one way or another.
That's on OPM.
A lot of the...
But there is a history. There is a history.
But a lot of the press reports have mentioned that China has been responsible for this latest OPM hack and the other attacks for the healthcare companies here in the U.S. And I think we need to look at it and say, if it's true, and give them credit for understanding weaknesses that we have and being very successful at going in and mining personal information from American citizens. And it's one of the problems that we grapple with on the intelligence community, is because a lot of what we do is behind closed doors. Most Americans, and I say probably 99.9% of Americans, don't know anything about NSA, and don't even know what it stands for, or even that it's a branch of the United States military. But we have politicians in this town who go out and demagogue NSA and other folks within the intelligence community, and I think China and other countries are seeing this as a huge weakness for us and are taking advantage of it.
China and Russia, this is a question about a different threat, and that's the threat to space systems. I was at an NRO ground station last week for this documentary we're working on. They talked a lot about, and Betty Sapp has talked about this as well, health and safety of the satellites. That's space junk, but it's also weapons in space. So the question, how does the committee view the threat China and Russia pose to our space systems? How do you see the trade-offs that need to be made for space control affecting other national security programs?
Well, it's something that we grapple with all the time. One of the, it's very expensive, as everybody here is well aware, to not only build a satellite, but also to launch a satellite. And the decisions that we're making in Congress right now are really decisions that are going to be, when you talk about actually these new satellites being deployed, it's 5 years, even 10 years down the road. And so we're trying to look at strategically, how do we make the best decisions to, at the congressional level, to provide proper oversight of NRO and others, but at the same time, make sure that we have the capabilities that we need into the future. The big debate going on right now is big satellites versus having multiple smaller satellites. It's something that it's really tough for members of Congress to dive into an issue like this, because it takes a considerable amount of time and effort to really understand how these programs work. Because you all spend a majority of your time working on this. Mr. Schiff and I, have a lot of other responsibilities. So it's one of the reasons why we changed up how the committee operates, and we broke the committee into subcommittees, so that now we have a subcommittee that specifically focuses on the NRO and on our defense satellite systems. So we're trying to do a better job of providing oversight. We're making sure that we scrub all the budgets as best as we can and work it out with our Senate counterparts. So it's just going to be it's always going to be an ongoing challenge, and we're just trying to put the policy mechanisms in place so that we do the best job we can.
Congressman Schiff?
We focus on this issue of the resilience of our overhead architecture quite extensively, and it's a profound concern of ours. I think, we were just talking about cyber and the kind of asymmetric battlefield in cyber. I fear the same is true in terms of our overhead architecture, that, once you develop a capability of taking down a satellite, it's probably going to be far cheaper to utilize that capability than to build and launch satellites. If it ever got to that, it would be pretty ugly in terms of our continued ability to defend against either Russia or China, which are developing very sophisticated anti-satellite programs. What we wrestle with in the committee is the various trade-offs in terms of, what's the cost of making satellites more resilient, what orbits are safer, what are you giving up in terms of capabilities by going to different orbits with an eye towards resilience. How does that issue of the vulnerability of our overhead architecture influence whether we should have fewer, more expensive, more capable overhead vehicles, or we should have fewer, perhaps more vulnerable but less costly vehicles? So that certainly weighs into the decisions we make about future architecture. I'm not sure there's a right answer here, but we are very concerned about the growing Russian and Chinese capabilities.
You talked about offensive capabilities with cyber. You say that Russia and China are advancing their offensive capabilities with satellites. Is the U.S. doing the same as a deterrent?
Well, I think we are preparing for every eventuality. So, in addition to making sure that we have our own capabilities, I think it's very prudent for us to undertake our military planning with an eye to how would we operate if we lost some of our space capabilities. We're so reliant on them now in countless ways. I think we also need to make sure we're planning for contingencies where we may not have access to those very useful capabilities.
Okay, this is a big picture question from someone in the audience, but interesting. After becoming chair, ranking member of the Select Committee, did you change a position due to information you received? Were you surprised by anything you learned? Throw that to both of you.
Yeah, so, the good thing is that Adam and I have been on the committee a while, and Mr. Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Ruppersberger did a really good job of working in a bipartisan way and involved the committee members. So there's not a lot. Most of what we deal with at what they call the Gang of Eight level is mostly bad stuff, but nothing too much different, I would say. I don't think I've changed my mind on anything. I don't know about you.
No, I would agree. I don't think those few areas where we have additional briefings now than we had before change your view so much on the broader policy issues that you're dealing with. It may add insights into capabilities or problems or covert action, but I don't think that it has that much of an impact on the bigger scheme of things. But I will say that my own view of things, I think, is fairly constantly changing, and not just as a ranking, but with the information we get every day. And I think and I think it's true probably for the whole committee. We spend a lot of our time and energy focused on the problem of Iraq and Syria, and Libya and Yemen. And of course, those situations are constantly in flux. And so I find myself continually thinking about whether something I thought was the right strategy or approach 6 months ago is still the right approach now. And given the carnage going on there, it just, I think, weighs on all of us.
This relates to the question of terrorism. How critical is open source intelligence to the fight against terrorism, and what initiatives is the HPSCI championing to ensure open source intelligence is a tool in the toolbox?
So if I understand the question, if you're dealing with, if you just look at the broad sense of open source and how that relates to, I think, is the question meaning how quickly do we get open source versus the intelligence community providing us intelligence?
Well, I guess the first question is as simple as how critical is it? I hear this a lot when I speak to intelligence officials, how open source is key.
Yeah.
For instance, jihadi websites, right, and how they're linking up that way. Although I know a lot of that stuff's going dark too. So.
Yeah. So I would say that the key there is that we get information almost immediately because of all of the new mechanisms for people to report on Twitter, Facebook, and the broader World Wide Web. The only challenge with it is you have to be careful because oftentimes those first reports are wrong, even if they're not trying to be wrong, or they're not. There's no malice or some type of counter intelligence effort on behalf of the news agencies. It's just a lot of times they just get some of the facts wrong. So it's tough for us you can't just take open source and then jump to a conclusion. And we spend a lot of time dealing with that because we have a lot of the members who are not on the committee, they read something in the press and they run up, I'm sure this happens to you all the time, Adam, but almost on a daily basis, they run up with, oh, I read this on the internet. What are you guys doing about this? And, a lot of times, those happen to be wrong, or they're or somebody editorialized on it. So, but at the same time, it's a critical tool for us, I think, and the broader IC, just to know what others are thinking and to see what opportunities are being created by open source reporting that's happening so quickly, just with camera phones and everything else, as technology continues to change. I mean, just look what ISIS has been able to do, how much they've improved over what Al Qaeda was able to do just a decade or more, a decade and a half ago. Essentially now, as long as they can communicate in English and get right into the United States on a constant basis, and it's something that we're having to deal with as technology continues to evolve and change.
I think the open source capability is extraordinarily important, and I think we have a lot more to mine from open sources. If you look at ISIS and the whole explosion of ISIS's use of social media, that has provided obviously a recruiting bonanza for ISIS, but it's also allowed us to gain tremendous insights into ISIS and how it operates, how it recruits people. And also, as you can see from the spate of arrests over the last few months of people in the United States providing material support for terrorist organizations, a lot of that information is derived from their use of social media, so they're kind of ultimate open source. But quite separate and apart from the terrorism issue, we've gained a lot of insights from open sources about what's going on in Ukraine and Russian military involvement, and a lot of that information is just gleaned from open sources. So I think there's tremendous value in it, and if you're not careful, sometimes you can invest a fortune and take considerable risks with human intelligence when you can find out the same or comparable information through open sources. So I think we have to continue to be particularly attuned to the open source information that's out there, and open to ideas from the private sector about how they can assist us in the analysis of open source information, because I think it's really a key component. There certainly is some bad information out there, and you can create problems when you rely on it. One of the probably most profound illustrations of that is some of the open source information about what happened in Benghazi proved to be completely wrong. So there are problems and vulnerabilities with an excessive reliance on open source materials, but I think the potential there is just extraordinary, and it's already been very important for us.
I brought this up in my opening remarks, but it was the revelations this week from WikiLeaks about NSA spying on French presidents, of course, following the spying on Merkel going back. And we know the president has, in effect, changed the policy since 2013. So the question here is the French public overreacting? And I might just add, from an intelligence perspective, cost-benefit, in terms of how it upset the relationships with allies, France and Germany. What is gained from that sort of intelligence gathering? Is it worth what's lost?
Well, I always answer these questions in the broad sense of, let's not kid ourselves. All countries spy on all countries all the time. I mean, even when they're not, even if they're not an intelligence agency, all the embassies that are here in Washington, they all have people that attend our hearings, that come and meet with us, that guess what? They write intelligence reports, on us, on Adam and I, on many chairmen, and other, and other issues that pertain that are important to our allies and to other nation states around the globe. So I just think we shouldn't kid ourselves here. Clearly WikiLeaks has been very damaging, I think, to our relationship with many countries, and we've spent a lot of time and effort all kind of arguing amongst allies, and while we're not keeping our eye on the ball, which is that, as Adam said yesterday, said earlier, that if you don't know that you're been, I'm just paraphrasing you, so you said it much more eloquently than I can ever say, Adam, but if you don't think you've been spied on or had your computer hacked or email hacked, you just don't know about it. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So you've got the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, most likely over all of our networks, not only here in the United States, but of our allies. And the more time that we spend arguing about whether or not, there was some intelligence report about the president of some country, is really just a waste of our time.
Do you agree? Because this is not just about an embassy attaché visiting a hearing. This is about intercepting private conversations on private cell phones. I mean, in the case of Merkel, but also private communications.
Yeah, but so we're not going to, as you know, Jim, we're not going to confirm or deny again of that because we don't know what the truth is on the reports. But if countries, many countries have capabilities to do essentially wiretaps, and if I'm in Europe and Adam and I are talking on the phone, we just assume that they're listening to our conversation.
Right.
And so that's just the way it is.
Do you agree?
They hear a lot of talk about the Raiders when we're on the cells together. And they think it's code for something else. Well, I do think that with respect to any intelligence gathering effort, particularly in this day and age where you have kind of the glorification of insiders like Edward Snowden, you have the foreign hacking, you have the WikiLeaks. You pretty much have to assume that ultimately whatever you're doing is going to be disclosed. And that's a kind of a revolutionary thought in the intel world. It obviously didn't used to be this way. But in this day and age, you have to have a contingency plan for, hey, what if this is disclosed? And I think in the case of allies, and I think this really drove the policy decision by the administration, we have to ask, what's the cost-benefit analysis? Are we gaining such important information that it's worth the risk, it's worth the potential alienation of an adversary? And we can't comment on whether any of these allegations are correct, but that analysis has to be done. And I think that in the past, that analysis wasn't always done. And it probably wasn't always done for a couple reasons. One is our technological capabilities in the last 10 or 20 years have improved so phenomenally, so exponentially, that I'm not sure that the policy analysis of it kept up with the increased capability. So this is true in terms of like the telephone metadata program and other things. I'm not sure that we had as vigorous an internal discussion as we should have because the capabilities were just growing so profoundly. The other part of it is, in the past, secrets often remain secret. And so that didn't prompt the thinking about, okay, what's the impact going to be on this relationship if this program is discovered? So I think that's changed. And I think with respect to the programs that we work on, that the intelligence community presents to the FISA court, we ought to always be asking ourselves several questions. Is it constitutional and legal? Is it effective and efficient? Is there another way it can be structured to better protect privacy? What are the consequences if the program is made public? What impact would it have on our friends or foes? All these questions I think we need to be thinking about. And there isn't obviously going to be a bright line in every one of them. But I think that kind of cost-benefit analysis really has to be undertaken.
We're down to our last 3 minutes, but there's a question here that's come up twice or 3 times actually, and it goes back to cyber, but there's a sharp question, so I'll ask for direct answers. Is there a red line for cyber attacks and a real U.S. response? Is there something that, whether it's Russia or China or North Korea, would do that just goes beyond the pale and it would spark a real, punishing response?
Well, we may have already, I'll just answer it quickly, we may already be there. Once we confirm if indeed the Chinese did hack into OPM and steal a lot of data on our citizens, clearly that would be a red line for myself and many members of Congress, I think.
So what would the response be if that is a red line, if it's determined and attributed?
I don't think it'd be good to get into what the appropriate response would be on this stage. But there would be a variety of options that we would, clearly work closely with the White House and the leadership to try to, lend our support where we can to build that response.
I think that we're going to need to analyze both who the attackers are and what the motivation was and what the damage was. So, in the case of a foreign actor like North Korea that engages in a deliberate attack that does damage, I think that calls for a retaliatory response. If you have a nation state that is engaged in foreign intelligence gathering, that might require a different response, and that may not be in the same category. It calls, I think, back to what we were talking about earlier, which is we need to establish what are the rules of the road here. What is acceptable cyber conduct and what crosses that red line. But I think certainly an attack that does damage or an attack that's an act of theft, both of those things merit a response. And I'll just say one other thing, and this is kind of well, Sony was really a collision of two worlds for me. I represent Hollywood, quite literally. Hollywood is in my district. And for years, we've been fighting back against Chinese theft of intellectual property, which, you know, in the film industry takes the form of music and film and TV, et cetera. But there's been much broader theft than that in terms of intellectual property and research and development. And obviously we have a lot more work to do to establish one of the rules of the road is you don't use cyber capabilities for the purpose of gaining economic advantage or benefit or ripping off the R&D of your competitor. And there ought to be one response to that, which may be a response in the trade realm or in the WTO or in other ways. Cyber intrusions for the purpose of doing damage are one thing. Cyber intrusions that try to plant things that may make our infrastructure vulnerable, we might need to treat a different way. The long and the short of it is, though, I think there are red lines, and the response will depend on who the actor is, what the motivation was, and the degree of damage.
And now we're seeing it in Major League Baseball too, right? Hacking from team to team.
Right.
Congressman Nunes, Congressman Schiff, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Great to meet you. Always good to see you.